So I'm sure that some of you are wondering why Adrienne Maree Brown's words related to our topic of questioning integrity this morning, and whether or not this is where we need to go when we talk about realigning our understanding of the concept, nobody is perfect. But if I were to be radically honest, I would say that I'm not certain I can make it all fit together, wrapped up succinctly in 2,000 words, and have a beautiful conclusion at the end. But let's jump into this mess and see if we can come out of it together. As I've read through the materials of integrity, trying to understand what I think about it and what other people have had to say in regards to it, I find myself feeling caught between two spheres of thought. One is in which integrity is the person who has integrity as a whole or complete. They are undivided, much like an integer number, not a fraction or a decimal point, but a whole number. There is a sense of consistency and a sense of never leaving parts of ourselves behind. The other sphere is the one in which the person is honest, a sense of speaking truth about how we think and what we feel. There is a sense of authenticity and morals and principles that feel somewhat static and shiny, like my grandmother's silver. Both of these spheres don't seem to take into account the flexibility and the adaptability that I seek when searching for integrity. For me, integrity needs to meet me where I am at, with my own sense of humanness, with my own growth and shrinking, my own openness and closing off of truths. For me, integrity needs to take into account truths from the greater world, and it also needs to disregard truths that the world has pushed onto me, like the monkey on my back that I cannot get rid of. I loved the image of integrity in our story this morning, the empty pot. I could definitely see my 8-year-old self taking back an empty pot to that emperor. But I can also imagine myself not wanting to go back at all, feeling a sense of shame and guilt for not being able to live up to the expectations that were set upon me. Of course, I would like to be able to articulate it. I would not likely be able to articulate that. But that is what a sense of guilt and shame is, right? Not being able to live up to expectations. Living up to the expectations that the world puts on us. The expectations that society, patriarchy, heteronormativity put on us. Much like Brown said in her reflection. And even though I have been able to break the mold in some of those stereotypes and place them that have been placed upon me, being the breadwinner of a family and focusing on work instead of family, going into ministry at a young age instead of having a regular career first. I'm not diminutive or obedient, both statements that my parents would agree with. There are areas in my life where I want to fit into the mold. Areas where I hate that I am different and unable to easily slide into the norm. I want to have better skin. I want to be thin. I want to lose my excess weight and find time to go to the gym and stop eating crap food. And I could so easily fall into a never-ending cycle of yo-yo diets and exercising regimes, followed up by gluttony and self-indulgence. And yet, somehow, ignoring those truths, disregarding that piece of my whole being and allowing myself to find harmony with the fact that I have terrible skin and I'm not going to use outrageous chemicals to treat it, or that yo-yo dieting isn't really sustainable or the healthiest solution for me in the long term, feels more integral than allowing myself that wholeness. Ignoring some truths and allowing myself to challenge others brings me to this sense of integrity, finding my balance and knowing how I can manage, how much I can manage, and what I need to let go of helps me find integrity. Floating somewhere in between these two spheres, one of wholeness and the other of truth, and completely disregarding the static formula of both, allows me to find my integrity. One of our famous Unitarian writers, Henry David Thoreau, speaks of this idea of integrity in his book, Walden, Life in the Woods. We quote him in the back of our gray hymnal. It's a responsive reading. Here's what he originally had to say. I went into the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation until it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave it close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world. Or, if life were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. Thoreau spent over 2 years living predominantly self-sustained in his little cottage with his large garden in upstate Massachusetts. He went there in order to live deliberately. This time has been called by many, and even by Thoreau himself, as a social experiment, an attempt at spiritual discovery, and a personal declaration of independence. Filled with allegory and contemplation of a better life, Thoreau criticizes what he sees in a desperate existence, one that he sees most of his contemporaries living. Not only does he criticize society and its culture of consumerism, materialism, and the destruction of nature, but he attempts to and writes about a life that engages the opposite of these cultural norms, by building his own house and producing most of his food and having very little materials to satisfy his wandering mind, but being content with writing and reading materials. The story of Walden is that of a man's life when he attempts to live his values, the values that he holds highest. He states that in order to live deliberately, he must have self-reliance and be able to manage on his own. Although, as I read through this book, I recognize many instances when he is clearly not self-reliant, and indeed is in great need of his family and friends. Thoreau required the support of a wealthy benefactor in Ralph Waldo Emerson. His mother would bring him sandwiches and take home his laundry regularly. Although the excerpt makes it seem that Thoreau was isolated and held off from the rest of society by the words that were written down, in reality, he was a 20-minute walk from his house in Concord, Massachusetts. He refused to admit it in any writing, however, how necessary it was for connection and how self-reliance doesn't always work out the way we want it to. One of Thoreau's contemporaries was Theodore Parker, the author of the words from our first hymn this morning, Be Ours a Religion, also had some interesting tangles with his own integrity. Theodore Parker is famously known throughout Unitarian Universalist communities for being the father of transcendentalism, a philosophy that attempts to merge intellectualism and spirituality. He was one of the first Unitarian ministers to deny that the Bible had any miraculous authority, and he declared that it was full of myths. He was also known to be an abolitionist. It was said about him that he would help escaped slaves by allowing them to stay in his home on their way to Canada. And he was said to have written his sermons with a loaded pistol on his writing desk in order to keep safe the slaves in his charge. And yet, even though he went to such incredibly great lengths, there is plenty of evidence, both in his writing and in the many actions that he took while he was alive, that Theodore Parker was a white supremacist and believed that racial science supported his understandings of the superiority of the Caucasian race. Although I recognize that these are two drastically different ways of being incongruent with one's life, and perhaps out of integrity with oneself, it does help us to get back to that idea that integrity is not a static concept, that integrity is an ever-shifting and changing concept that cannot be pinned down to one time or space. If we can hold these two men up as beacons of our history in our faith tradition, if we can believe that both Thoreau and Parker were monumental to this faith and recognize that they fell very short of their own ideals, that they fall short of our ideals, can we still believe that they have integrity? Similarly, for me, I know that when I was in an abusive relationship, I was ready to go to bat for my husband. I was willing to cut off ties with people who said he was hurting me, that I had changed because of him. In fact, I did cut ties with many people, my parents and family included. I disregarded what they had to say because somehow I believed that in order to maintain my integrity, I would have to see his worth and dignity, and we would be able to work through our challenges. That his worth and dignity, that first principle which Unitarian Universalists espouse to, was just as important as mine, and we would be able to find wholeness if we could overcome the lesser parts of our nature. It was part of my own understanding of myself, of who I wanted to be, of how I wanted the world to see me, that kept me in that relationship. I recognized that his behavior was wrong, and I believed that I should stay anyways. I wasn't willing to see that I could still witness his worth and dignity and leave him. I wasn't willing to shift my understanding of having integrity, and so I stayed, allowing my sense of self to diminish instead. Again, not as drastic as white supremacist points of view, or even an unwillingness to see the support of females in one's own life as a crucial reliance to their existence, but nonetheless, still out of sync with my own integrity, or a shift in how I viewed my integrity. Never a static ideal, but something ever evolving and shifting with our own knowledge and sense of self. Questioning integrity. What does it look like? Are we able to narrow it down to one simple definition? Probably not. Are we able to narrow it down to our own personal definition? For a moment in time, but not necessarily for our whole life. As we move through this theme of integrity, I encourage you to sit with these questions and ponder. What does it mean to be a person of integrity?